Step through the gates of a medieval town on market day, and the world comes alive with a thunderous roar of voices, the smell of roasting meat, and the glitter of coins changing hands. Here, in the market square, life thrums like a great heartbeat, pulsing through every street and alley. Merchants cry out their prices, peasants shuffle in with baskets of eggs or turnips, and children dart between legs, chasing after stray chickens. The market is chaos, but it is the kind of chaos that binds a community together, where every man, woman, and child has a part to play. At dawn, the square is already stirring. Farmers from the surrounding countryside arrive with carts creaking under the weight of barley, oats, or wheels of cheese wrapped in cloth. From another road come herders, prodding squealing pigs or bleating goats toward the pens where they will be sold. The city's bakers display fresh loaves still steaming, the golden crusts cracking beneath the morning chill. And from the edges of town, tanners and fishmongers bring their trade, accompanied by odors so pungent that townsfolk wrinkle their noses before approaching. But markets are not only for necessities. Look closer, and the stalls sparkle with curiosities: dyed cloth in shades of crimson and green, imported glass beads that shimmer in the sun, and pewter cups engraved with saints or beasts. For the poor, these luxuries remain out of reach, but still they crowd around, eyes wide with wonder. For nobles or wealthy burghers, such treasures are symbols of power and taste, proof that their coin can command the labor of distant lands. In this square, the wealth of the world is condensed into a riot of color and sound. It is not only trade that fills the air, but also news. Messengers from nearby villages spread word of bandits on the roads, or of a noble feud spilling into violence. Minstrels sing ballads of kings and knights, their songs passed from one crowd to the next until they become the gossip of the week. Here, the market becomes the medieval newspaper, a place where rumor grows legs and marches from ear to ear. The clang of a blacksmith's hammer mingles with the laughter of ale sellers, while a priest scolds from the edge of the crowd, warning against sin in the midst of commerce. The market square is also a stage for spectacle. A juggler tosses knives into the air, thrilling the children. A bear on a chain dances reluctantly for the amusement of a few coins. Charlatans appear, selling miracle potions made of herbs and lies, their voices booming with promises of eternal health or luck in love. The line between trade and entertainment blurs, for both seek to win the same prize, the clinking silver in a buyer's pouch. For the common peasant, the market is more than spectacle. It is survival. A family may bring the single pig they have fattened all year, hoping to sell it for enough coin to pay rent or buy seed for next season's harvest. Bargaining is not just sport, but necessity. A battle of words where the difference of a few pennies might decide whether a child goes hungry. And yet, amid the struggle, there is joy. Families reunite, old friends embrace, and laughter bursts out over shared mugs of ale. Markets also carry a spiritual weight. Many are held on church feast days, when the faithful crowd into town not only to buy and sell, but to worship. Pilgrims pass through, clutching relics or charms bought from stalls set up just outside the cathedral. The sacred and the profane mingle freely, the toll of bells ringing out above the cries of vendors, the smell of incense battling with the stench of fish. To live in the Middle Ages is to know that holiness and survival walk hand in hand. Above it all, the market square stands as the true heart of the town. Castles might tower, cathedrals might awe, but it is here, in the clamor of voices, the press of bodies, the hum of trade, that life truly happens. The market is where a stranger might become a neighbor, where fortunes might be won or lost, and where the pulse of medieval life beats most strongly. It is no mere backdrop. It is the very soul of the age, vibrant, dangerous, and alive. If peasants brought life to the market, it was the merchants who gave it shape. Their stalls lined the square with order and ambition, their voices rising above the din as they hawked cloth, spices, and tools. Yet merchants were not mere sellers. They were the lifeblood of commerce, the ones who transformed simple marketplaces into engines of prosperity. And as their wealth grew, so too did their power, challenging even the authority of knights and nobles who once scorned trade as a lowly pursuit. In the early Middle Ages, a wandering merchant was a suspicious figure, viewed as little better than a vagrant. But as towns expanded, merchants formed guilds, tight-knit brotherhoods that guarded their craft with iron rules. Each guild controlled its trade: the butchers, the weavers, the shoemakers, the goldsmiths. To join one was no easy task. An apprentice might toil for years under a master, earning little more than food and lodging, before proving himself worthy of becoming a journeyman. Only after more years of skill and service might he rise to master status, allowed to set up his own stall beneath the guild's emblem. Guilds gave merchants not only security, but power. They regulated prices, punished dishonest traders, and ensured that no outsider could undercut their members. They were both shield and sword, protecting their brothers while enforcing their dominance. For the consumer, this meant reliability. The bread weighed fairly, the cloth woven strong. For rivals, it meant exclusion and, sometimes, violence. Those who dared to defy the guilds risked more than ruined trade. They risked their lives. The rivalries between guilds could tear towns apart. A quarrel between butchers and fishmongers might erupt into street brawls, knives flashing as quickly as insults. In Florence, wool and silk guilds vied for supremacy, their contests shaping politics as much as fashion. In London, the merchant guilds wrestled with the crown for privileges, each side knowing that whoever controlled trade controlled the pulse of the city itself. These rivalries were not only about goods, they were about power, pride, and the right to define the identity of a town. Yet beneath their strict codes, merchants also learned the art of cunning. Some schemed to hoard goods until famine struck, then sold them at obscene prices. Others secretly mingled inferior materials into cloth or diluted wine with water. Though guilds punished when they could, many tricks slipped through. Markets were not simply places of honest exchange. They were battlefields of wit, where deception could bring fortune as swiftly as ruin. Still, for every schemer, there were honest men and women whose labor brought stability. Cloth merchants, with bales of wool dyed in vivid hues, were the backbone of Northern Europe's economy. Spice merchants, arriving from Venice or Genoa, dazzled buyers with pepper, saffron, and cinnamon that cost their weight in silver. Even humble tradesmen, like shoemakers or tanners, became pillars of their towns through steady guild work. For them, the guild was not only protection, but a family, binding them together in a world where survival often depended on loyalty. As merchants rose, so too did resentment. Nobles, who once measured power only in land and bloodlines, looked with scorn at these commoners growing rich from trade. Yet resentment turned to fear as merchants began to build towering houses, fund cathedrals, and influence kings. Money bought what birth could not, and soon guildmasters sat on councils, their voices equal or greater than those of knights. This shift marked the dawn of a new social order, one that would reshape Europe forever. Thus, the market was not merely a place of buying and selling. It was a crucible where ambition clashed with tradition, where rivalries erupted in blood, and where merchants carved out a new power that rivaled even the nobility. The guild emblem above a stall was more than a sign of trade. It was a banner in an unending war of influence. And within the square, beneath the shouts of hawkers and the clang of coin, a silent revolution was already stirring. If local bread, cheese, and wool kept the market alive, it was the rare and exotic goods that made it thrum with wonder. To step into a medieval marketplace was to step into a miniature world, where the familiar mingled with the marvelous, and where peasants rubbed shoulders with sailors who had seen horizons they could only imagine. Each bolt of silk, each bag of spice, carried with it the whisper of distant lands and the danger of the journeys that brought them. The most prized of all were the spices, tiny treasures that transformed even the plainest meal into a feast. Pepper from India, cinnamon from Ceylon, cloves from the Moluccas, and saffron from the East were sold for prices that rivaled silver and gold. To sprinkle such flavors on a noble's table was a mark of prestige, proof that his wealth could stretch across continents. Merchants guarded these wares jealously, measuring each ounce with precision, for a handful of peppercorns might pay a servant's wages for weeks. Silks shimmered like captured sunlight. From Byzantium, Persia, and eventually China itself, they came in colors that defied the drab hues of local wool. A noblewoman clothed in silk was not only dressed in beauty, she was wrapped in status, declaring her household's connection to the wide and wondrous world. Alongside silk came brocades, embroidered with threads of gold or silver, glistening like treasures from heaven. Only the wealthiest could dream of such garments, but the poor still pressed close to touch them, if only for a fleeting moment. Then came the furs of the north, ermine, sable, and fox, so soft and warm they seemed spun from winter itself. Kings and bishops wrapped themselves in them, declaring their majesty with every sweep of fur-lined cloak. The church, too, became a ravenous customer, for bishops and abbots loved to display the bounty of their sees in lavish vestments. Even in religion, wealth found a way to glitter. Markets were also windows onto the dangers of travel. Caravans trudged across deserts stalked by bandits. Ships sailed seas teeming with pirates, and merchants risked not only fortune, but life for their cargo. A single voyage from Venice to Alexandria might return with enough spices to make a man rich beyond imagination, or to sink him, body and soul, beneath the waves. Every sack of cinnamon, every roll of silk, was a victory over peril, a testament to courage and greed alike. Yet exotic goods did more than dazzle. They changed society itself. Spices altered diets, encouraging nobility to demand more refined cuisine. Silks and gems inspired laws known as sumptuary codes, which forbade common folk from wearing what was reserved for elites. The hunger for trade gave rise to great port cities, Venice, Genoa, Bruges, where merchants became princes and palaces rose from commerce alone. The marketplace was not just a reflection of this change, it was the engine that drove it forward. But alongside wonder came envy, and envy bred danger. A merchant displaying foreign wares risked thieves, jealous rivals, or corrupt officials eager to claim a share. Spices were sometimes adulterated with dust or bark, silks cut with inferior threads, jewels replaced with clever forgeries. Buyers, dazzled by novelty, could never be certain if they were holding treasure or trickery. Trust was as valuable as silver, and betrayal often lurked beneath the velvet. Still, for the people of a medieval town, the sight of exotic goods was a glimpse into a wider world, a reminder that beyond their fields and walls stretched lands filled with unimaginable beauty and peril. To hold a piece of silk was to touch a thread of Asia. To taste a pinch of pepper was to taste the sweat of sailors, the blood of caravans, and the ambition of men who risked everything for wealth. In these goods, the farthest reaches of the earth were gathered into the palm of the hand, transforming the marketplace into a stage where the world itself performed. Close your eyes in a medieval marketplace, and you could know where you stood not by sight, but by sound and smell alone. The air was a cacophony, a chorus of shouts and laughter, haggling and cursing, church bells tolling above the din, and the braying of livestock echoing through narrow streets. Each corner of the market sang its own song, pungent or sweet, clattering or melodic, weaving together into a symphony of commerce. The first sound to greet you was the vendors' cries. "Fine herrings! Fresh from the river this morning!" shouted the fishmongers, their stalls slick with scales and blood. Butchers bellowed of lamb, beef, and sausages, knives flashing as they hacked at carcasses suspended on hooks. Bakers sang out in rhythmic chants, advertising loaves of rye, barley bread, or sweet honey cakes warm from the oven. To drown out rivals, merchants raised their voices higher and higher until the market roared like an unruly crowd at a tourney. Animals added their own discordant music. Chickens squawked in wicker cages, pigs squealed as they were dragged to pens, and cows bellowed with impatience in the press of bodies. Dogs barked, both as guardians and thieves, snatching scraps from distracted sellers. The clash of metal rang out from blacksmiths hammering horseshoes or sharpening blades, their stalls blazing with sparks that smelled of burnt iron and sweat. And somewhere, always, a minstrel strummed a lute, or a bagpiper wheezed out a tune that floated above the chaos like a stubborn bird refusing to be drowned out. If sound was overwhelming, smell was its equal. The sharp tang of onions and garlic mixed with the sweetness of baked apples, clove-studded wine, and candied almonds. Alehouses bled their scent into the streets, sour beer mingling with the warm yeast of brewing. But not all was pleasant. The stench of tanned hides, fish gone slightly stale, and dung from penned animals made nostrils flare and stomachs churn. The medieval market was a place where the sacred fragrance of incense wafting from a nearby chapel might collide with the rank odor of rotting cabbage in a single breath. Yet these smells were not merely background, they were maps. A peasant could follow the whiff of smoked pork to the butcher, or the trail of honey and spice to the confectioner's stall. To the seasoned townsfolk, each scent marked a corner, each aroma a landmark in the crowded maze. Even strangers could find their way guided by their noses, for the market told its story in odors as much as in words. The rhythm of the market was also measured in the ring of coin. The sharp clink of silver pennies, the dull thud of clipped copper, the jingle of purses being untied and tied again. These were the notes of survival. A handful of coins could mean food for a family, a dowry for a daughter, or ruin if spent unwisely. Money changers added their own melody, weighing foreign coins on brass scales, muttering prayers against fraud while their fingers moved with unnerving speed. But beneath the noise, a constant hum of human life persisted. Murmurs of gossip, sighs of fatigue, bursts of laughter when a bargain was struck, and sharp cries of anger when someone was cheated. Quarrels could flare into brawls, sending barrels crashing and vendors screaming. Sometimes, the sheriff's men waded in to restore order with the flat of their swords. Yet even fights became part of the market's music, abrupt drum beats in an endless song. The sounds and smells of commerce lingered even after sunset. When the stalls were dismantled and the animals herded home, the square carried their ghosts. The sour tang of spilled ale, the sweetness of crushed apples trodden into mud, the echo of shouts still bouncing from stone walls. For townsfolk lying in their beds, the market never truly faded. Its sounds and smells clung to their clothes, their purses, their dreams. It was not simply a place they visited. It was a presence that lived with them, as constant as hunger, as vivid as life itself. On market days that coincided with feast days, the boundary between commerce and devotion vanished. Stalls clustered around church steps, relics gleamed beside loaves of bread, and the voices of priests and vendors mingled in the same square. In the Middle Ages, faith was never separate from daily life, and the marketplace was proof. Here, salvation itself could be bought, sold, or bargained for like a sack of grain. Pilgrims came in droves, their cloaks dusty, their sandals worn thin from weeks of travel. They carried badges of tin or lead pinned to their hats, stamped with the images of shrines they had visited. Scallop shells from Santiago, keys from Rome, swords from Canterbury. Each badge was both proof of faith and a commodity, sold cheaply at stalls that turned devotion into business. Merchants knew pilgrims were eager to display their piety, and they supplied them with endless tokens, cheap, fragile, but worn proudly as symbols of grace. Then there were the relics, displayed in gilded reliquaries or simple boxes depending on the wealth of the seller. A lock of the Virgin's hair, a splinter of the true cross, a saint's bone. Whether genuine or false, these objects drew eager crowds. For the poor, even the chance to touch such a relic promised healing or forgiveness. For the wealthy, owning one elevated their prestige, binding their household to heaven's favor. But in the shadows of the square, whispers spread that many relics were fakes. Pig bones passed off as martyrs, or splinters taken from common beams. Faith and fraud walked hand in hand. The church itself was not immune to commerce. Priests and friars preached to the crowds, urging them to buy indulgences, slips of parchment that promised the shortening of time in purgatory. Some towns saw entire markets dedicated to such sales, the cries of pardon mingling with the cries of fishmongers. To modern eyes it seems scandalous, but for medieval souls, it was a comfort. Salvation could be measured, weighed, and purchased, even if only by pennies. Yet, for all the corruption, faith in the marketplace was not entirely hollow. Pilgrimage routes gave life to towns, filling inns and stalls with travelers from far and wide. Markets sprang up near shrines, growing fat on the trade of candles, rosaries, and food. The presence of pilgrims also brought stories, tales of miracles in distant lands, of holy visions, of sins forgiven. The market became a crossroads not only of goods but of belief, where faith was exchanged as readily as coin. The mingling of sacred and profane could sometimes turn uneasy. A merchant selling sausages might set up beside a friar preaching repentance, the smell of pork wafting over the solemn chant. A relic seller might be accused of fraud, dragged before the bailiff even as pilgrims pressed forward with hope in their eyes. Yet this tension only deepened the vibrancy of the scene. In the medieval world, no wall divided faith from life. Markets were chapels under the open sky, where the holy and the worldly jostled shoulder to shoulder. For queens, nobles, and wealthy burghers, such markets were opportunities to display their piety as much as their wealth. To sponsor a relic, to fund a shrine, or even to buy indulgences in full view of the crowd was a statement of devotion and power. Charity might be given in coin, bread, or alms, but always with eyes watching, for piety, like trade, was a form of currency. Thus, the market of faith was more than a place to buy goods. It was a mirror of medieval life itself, where belief and survival intertwined. A pilgrim might arrive with nothing but hope and leave with a charm said to guard against plague. A peasant might sell eggs and spend his profit on a candle for the Virgin. A noble might kneel before a relic, unsure if it was real, but desperate enough to believe. In the marketplace, salvation hung in the air like incense, traded and treasured as much as bread and wine. If the market was the heart of the medieval town, then law was its stern hand, ready to strike when the pulse grew unruly. The marketplace was not only a center of trade, but also the stage for justice, where sheriffs, bailiffs, and guards patrolled with watchful eyes. Here, law was not hidden in dusty halls. It was public, loud, and theatrical, meant as much to frighten as to correct. At the edge of the square stood the pillory, a wooden frame where offenders had their heads and hands locked fast. A man who cheated his customers, or a woman who sold watered-down ale, might find themselves trapped before the jeering crowd. Children pelted them with rotten vegetables, neighbors hurled insults, and the humiliation often stung more than the punishment itself. In this way, the market reminded all who gathered that honesty was demanded, or at least enforced, in its bustling stalls. Justice was not subtle. Thieves caught with a stolen purse might be whipped across the square, each lash a warning to others tempted by greed. In harsher cases, they might be hanged on the gallows erected at the town's edge, their bodies left swinging as grim deterrents. Executions were public spectacles, drawing crowds as large as any fair. For the medieval mind, punishment was not just retribution. It was performance, a morality play staged beneath the eyes of both man and God. Officials also weighed and measured, ensuring merchants did not cheat their customers. Market inspectors carried scales, testing bread to confirm it matched the official weight, or checking ale to ensure it was strong enough. A dishonest baker might have his loaves seized, a corrupt merchant fined heavily. In some towns, bakers who cheated were forced to ride backward on a donkey through the square, mocked by the crowd as a lesson to others. These punishments were as creative as they were cruel, meant to shame as well as to correct. But justice itself was not always just. Wealthy merchants could bribe officials, buying their way out of trouble, while peasants bore the full brunt of punishment for smaller crimes. A noble's son might escape with a fine for an act that would have cost a beggar his hand. The market square reflected the order of the world. Law was a net that caught the small fish, while letting the great ones slip through. Still, even the powerful were not untouchable, and a lord too brazen in his abuses could find the wrath of townsfolk rising against him. Punishments also carried a ritual quality. The church often blessed judgments, declaring them instruments of divine justice. A thief whipped in the square was told it was not only man's law he broke, but God's. Processions sometimes accompanied executions, priests chanting as if to remind the condemned that salvation was possible even in the shadow of death. The marketplace, then, was not only a theater of law, but a pulpit, blending earthly authority with heavenly decree. For the ordinary folk, these scenes of punishment were woven into the rhythm of life. Children grew up watching thieves whipped, husbands and wives bargained while a culprit stood in the pillory, and executions became grim festivals that mingled horror with entertainment. The market was never just about buying. It was about seeing justice done, about being reminded of the thin line between survival and disgrace. Thus, the market square was as much a place of fear as of trade. Beneath the cries of hawkers and the laughter of children lingered the echo of screams, the sting of whips, the creak of gallows. Here, survival was not only about earning coin, but about obeying rules, spoken and unspoken. And every merchant, peasant, and noble who walked its cobblestones knew that in a single misstep, the bustling stage of commerce could become a stage of judgment. Beneath the clamor of merchants and the laughter of children, another rhythm pulsed through the medieval marketplace, the rhythm of shadows. For where coin and goods flowed freely, so too did greed and cunning. The market was a feast not only for honest traders, but for thieves, swindlers, and tricksters who moved like smoke between stalls, their eyes sharp for opportunity. If the square was the beating heart of the town, then they were its parasites, feeding on its lifeblood with clever fingers and silver tongues. Pickpockets thrived in the crush of the crowd. A nobleman examining bolts of cloth might find his purse cut from his belt by a deft knife. A pilgrim, distracted by relics, could lose the very coins meant to buy salvation. These thieves worked in teams, one jostling a victim, another slipping the prize free, a third vanishing with it into the alleys before a cry was raised. By the time the victim noticed, the thief was gone, swallowed by the market's chaos. Not all theft was silent. Some tricksters worked openly, their craft not in stealth, but deception. A seller of spices might mix dust with cinnamon, stretching his profit while cheating his buyer. Fishmongers sometimes pressed stones into the bellies of their wares to make them heavier on the scales. Even bakers, so often inspected by law, were known to water their dough or use cheaper grains, gambling that inspectors would not come that day. These frauds were harder to catch, for who could prove a loaf too light, or wine too thin unless the guild itself intervened? There were counterfeiters, too, men who clipped coins, shaving silver from their edges, or who struck false pennies with stolen molds. Such crimes were considered not just theft, but treason, for to tamper with the king's currency was to attack the crown itself. Yet even with death as the penalty, counterfeiters prowled the markets, their false coins passing from hand to hand until suspicion fell too late. Tricksters were not always malevolent. Some were entertainers who blurred the line between performance and swindle. Jugglers and storytellers might distract crowds with clever tricks, while accomplices rifled purses. Charlatans promised miracle cures, herbs to banish fever, powders to restore youth, amulets to ward off plague. Buyers laughed or believed, depending on their desperation. If the potion failed, the trickster was long gone, peddling his wares in another town. But shadows carried danger. A thief caught in the act risked swift and brutal justice, a hand chopped off, lashes in the square, or even a rope around the neck. Tricksters lived by wits, but died by exposure, always one unlucky moment from ruin. And yet, for many, the risk was worth it. Hunger drove peasants to steal bread. Ambition drove swindlers to cheat nobles. In a world where survival was uncertain, dishonesty became its own form of trade. Merchants and guilds fought back, hiring guards to watch stalls, setting traps for pickpockets, and spreading word of known cheats. Some guilds marked fraudsters with scars or brands, making their crimes visible forever. Yet for every thief punished, another rose, for the lure of the market's wealth was too great to resist. The dance between thief and merchant was endless, as old as the marketplace itself. And so the medieval market lived always in tension, bright with trade, yet shadowed by betrayal. To walk its cobblestones was to step into a theater of trust and suspicion, where every handshake could conceal a lie, and every smile might mask a trick. The honest and the dishonest lived side by side, each dependent on the other, for without wealth there could be no theft, and without theft there could be no fear to sharpen honesty. In its shadows, the market revealed its truest self, a place not only of commerce, but of cunning. In the bustle of the medieval marketplace, it was not only men who shaped trade. Women, too, were a constant presence, their voices rising above the crowd, their hands busy with goods, their presence woven into every exchange. For though chronicles often speak of kings and guildmasters, the market itself tells another story. One of women whose labor, wit, and resilience helped keep towns alive. At dawn, it was often women who arrived first, carrying baskets laden with eggs, milk, butter, or cheese. Dairy was their domain, and the morning air filled with the sharp tang of curds and the creamy promise of fresh milk. Housewives sold the surplus from their farms, earning precious pennies to stretch a household's budget. Alewives, too, brewed beer in their homes and sold it by the mug, their stalls noisy with laughter, quarrels, and sometimes scorn, for alewives were both essential and controversial, accused of cheating when the brew was weak, yet relied upon by every thirsty laborer. Women also wove and spun, bringing skeins of yarn, simple cloth, or embroidered goods to market. A peasant woman might sell wool spun through long winter nights, while in towns, widows of artisans sometimes carried on their husbands' trades. Laws and guilds often tried to restrict them, but necessity and skill found ways to break barriers. Markets were full of women who refused to be silent, who claimed their place in the economy with baskets, bolts, and barrels. Not all female traders lived by honest work. Just as men swindled, so too did women. Some sold watered-down ale, others disguised spoiled butter with herbs or salts. Gossip clung to them quickly, and accusations could be ruinous. An alewife branded a cheat might be dragged to the pillory, mocked with a tankard tied around her neck. Yet many endured the scorn, for the market was one of the few spaces where women could earn coin of their own, however precarious. Markets also gave women a social stage. Here they exchanged not only goods but news of births, marriages, scandals, and deaths. Gossip, often dismissed by chroniclers, was itself a kind of currency, traded across stalls and woven into the fabric of daily life. For women, whose voices were often silenced in courts and councils, the market was a forum where their words carried weight, shaping reputations and decisions in subtle but powerful ways. Yet the market was also a place of danger for women. Crowds pressed close, hands grasped too freely, and accusations of immorality were easily thrown. A woman too outspoken might be labeled a shrew, a witch, or worse. Some, especially those without husbands, became vulnerable to exploitation, their independence viewed with suspicion. And yet, time and again, women returned to the square, their presence as constant as the tolling of the church bell. Noblewomen, too, had their place in markets, though more as consumers than sellers. Their purchases, silks, spices, jewels, set the tone of fashion, shaping what merchants sought from distant lands. A noblewoman's visit to a fair was a spectacle in itself, her entourage sweeping through the stalls, her choices noted and imitated. In this way, women of every rank, from peasant to duchess, shaped the market, whether through labor or desire. Thus, the medieval market was not a man's world alone. It was a place where women carried baskets on their backs and kingdoms in their pockets, where they brewed, spun, bargained, and endured. Their voices rang through the square as surely as any merchant's cry, their labor as vital as any craftsman's. In the marketplace, the secret strength of medieval women revealed itself, not in chronicles or courts, but in the clatter of coins dropped into their hands. If the weekly market was the heartbeat of a town, the great fairs were its thunder. Once or twice a year, ordinary trade exploded into spectacle, transforming quiet fields and cobbled squares into seas of tents, banners, and endless noise. These were no simple gatherings of peasants selling eggs. They were carnivals of commerce that drew merchants from distant lands, pilgrims from foreign shores, and nobles eager to flaunt their wealth. For a few dazzling days, the fair turned a town into the center of the world. The most famous fairs, like those of Champagne in France or Bruges in Flanders, were legendary across Europe. Caravans traveled for weeks to reach them, laden with silks from the East, spices from Arabia, furs from Russia, and fine wool from England. Ships arrived at bustling harbors, their holds creaking with wine, salt, or precious metals. Merchants built temporary wooden stalls, forming entire districts of trade where languages mingled: French, Italian, Flemish, Arabic, even the occasional Greek. To walk through such a fair was to walk through continents, each corner of the square a gateway to another world. But these fairs were not only about goods, they were theaters of entertainment. Minstrels sang epic ballads, dancers spun in colorful skirts, and jesters drew laughter from weary travelers. Puppet shows mocked kings and priests with daring humor, while acrobats balanced on ropes strung between church towers. Even trained bears lumbered through the crowds, made to dance for coins. For peasants who lived lives of toil, the fair was their rare glimpse of joy, a time when hardship gave way to music, color, and marvel. Nobles turned the fairs into tournaments of display. Knights held jousts in fields outside the walls, their lances shattering before roaring crowds. Ladies paraded in gowns of imported silk, their jewels flashing like fire in the sun, reminding merchants that the wealth of trade always returned to noble hands. Banquets sprawled across long tables, while wine flowed like rivers and the air grew heavy with roasted meats. To attend a great fair was to witness not just trade, but the very theater of status. Yet beneath the laughter and spectacle lurked betrayal. Where wealth gathered, so did thieves and tricksters. Pickpockets swarmed the fairs like locusts, and counterfeiters spread false coins through the stalls. Some merchants slipped away in the night with buyers' money, leaving empty tents behind. Guilds and sheriffs fought to impose order, but the sheer size of the crowds made fraud inevitable. The fair was a dream of fortune, but also a gamble where ruin was as common as gain. Still, the fairs were vital engines of the medieval economy. Credit contracts were signed, debts settled, and new trade routes forged. Merchants often exchanged not coin, but promises of payment, early instruments of banking that would shape the rise of modern finance. In Champagne, whole networks of trust and credit were born from the yearly fairs, binding together distant towns and nations through invisible webs of obligation. What began as stalls of wool and spices became the foundations of capitalism itself. The fairs also brought the church into the heart of commerce. Many coincided with feast days, their timing no accident. Relics were paraded through the crowds, indulgences sold beside bolts of cloth. Pilgrims mingled with traders, their devotion spilling into the marketplace until faith and profit became indistinguishable. To the medieval mind, there was nothing strange in buying a relic with one hand and a pound of saffron with the other, for both promised a taste of heaven. For peasants, for nobles, for merchants, the fair was a world turned upside down. For a few days, the ordinary order of life dissolved. Strangers filled the streets, gold passed from hand to hand, laughter echoed late into the night. Then, as quickly as it had come, the fair vanished. The tents were dismantled, the fields lay empty, and silence fell where once thousands had shouted. But the memory lingered, and so did the wealth, tying towns together in networks of trade and trust that reshaped Europe. When the last stalls were packed away, the laughter faded, and the echoes of bargaining died into silence. The medieval market left behind more than an empty square. It left a legacy that shaped the very fabric of European life. For centuries, the market was more than a place of trade. It was the crucible where culture, faith, and society itself were forged. Its memory lingers in the very stones of old town squares, and its spirit still hums in the marketplaces of today. The medieval market was never just a place to buy and sell. It was the soul of a community, the theater of faith and fraud, the battlefield of guilds and thieves, the playground of peasants and nobles alike. Its legacy is not written only in ledgers or laws, but in the enduring truth that wherever humans gather to trade, they also gather to dream, to cheat, to laugh, to fight, and to live. And in that truth, the medieval market still lives on, as timeless as the clink of a coin falling into an outstretched hand. It also laid the foundations of modern economies. The exchange of coin, the rise of credit, and the growth of banking all found their roots in the market stalls, where merchants learned to trust contracts as much as silver. From the bargaining of peasants over eggs to the signing of great deals for caravans of wool, the market taught Europe the language of trade, a language still spoken in banks and stock exchanges centuries later. The market shaped culture as well. Minstrels and storytellers carried their songs across towns, spreading legends that outlived the kings they mocked. Fashions were born in fairs, where nobles bought silks and jewels that later inspired laws to restrain commoners from imitating them. Even faith bore its mark, for relics, indulgences, and pilgrim badges turned piety into commerce, binding the sacred and the profane in a single square. It was also a place of paradox. The market embodied freedom, peasants earning coin, women finding voices, merchants gaining power. But it was also a place of strict control, where guilds ruled with iron laws and justice struck without mercy. It gave opportunity, but also bred betrayal. It dazzled with luxury, but reeked of poverty. In its contradictions lay its strength, for it mirrored life itself in all its complexity. For the common folk, the legacy of the market was memory, of colors brighter than the fields, of music louder than the village, of goods and wonders from distant lands. For nobles, it was power, their coffers fattened by taxes and trade. For merchants, it was destiny, the path that led them from simple stalls to the foundations of modern cities. Each found something different in the market, but all were bound by its influence. Even today, when we step into a modern market square, beneath the spires of cathedrals, in towns still shaped by medieval streets, we feel the echo, the cries of vendors, the mingling of smells, the press of bodies. All survive, faint but insistent. We may call them farmers' markets or bazaars, but they are heirs to the same tradition, the same heartbeat that pulsed through medieval Europe. The medieval market created the first sense of urban community. Towns that had once been little more than fortified strongholds grew into bustling centers because of weekly markets and annual fairs. Around these spaces, guild halls were raised, cathedrals towered, and councils gathered. The square became not only a hub of commerce, but the stage of civic identity, where towns declared their pride and authority before the watching world.